Hello, my name is Lorna. I am a tutor at Chrysalis and I'm a psychotherapist. And today I'm going to take you through component 1, key models incorporated within the pluralistic approach, the psychodynamic approach. And in particular, today in module 1, we will be looking at Freudian drive theory, Erik Erikson's theory of the 8 ages of man, and Melanie Klein's object relations theory, and then some recapping on case conceptualization and contracting. So we have looked at Freudian theory before in year 2, and we know that it's quite a well-developed theory, quite a well-respected theory, but also it has changed considerably. We also know that Freud's theory was a catalyst for the developments of other opposing theories, such as behaviorism, and then along came person-centered theory, which again is really quite different. So an important thing to note about Freudian theory as well is that Freud had a number of students, a number of contemporaries, who often developed on from his theories into something that was their own theory. And we're going to look at a couple of those today. Before we do, we'll do a quick recap of some of the aspects of Freudian theory, just to remind us. So Freudian theory talks about drives, unconscious drives that are energized by libido, which is an energy within our psyche. Remember that we are talking here about psychodynamic theory, and the word itself, psychodynamic, actually describes a dynamic energy within our psyche, mainly coming from what Freud calls an unconscious part of our psyche. This means, in effect, that a lot of our behaviour, our emotions, our thoughts are driven by unconscious processes. And that can be quite a difficult one for us to actually appreciate and get our head around. And Freud says that actually there are no accidents. So, we intentionally drive our behaviour, but we don't actually consciously realise that we're doing so. So in terms of drive, Freud talks about libido, and libido is the energy within the system. And a little bit like the physical sciences, Freud considered that this energy within our system is a fixed quantity. So it kind of moves around and it moves up and down and rebalances itself in different ways. So we have a fixed quantity of this psychic energy with our own individual makeup, and this energy can then be directed in different ways, attached to various objects or complexes, and that then means that there is less energy elsewhere. And Freud says that life depends on our libidinal development, so that an essential energy to every activity carves the structure of our personality. So he also, in the latter part of the development of his theories, divided libido into 2 basic drives. So eros is a creative drive, a sexual drive, a life instinct. So it is about promoting life, growth, and increases a sense of tension in order to make that happen. It's a life force, an energy. But then comes the concept of thanatos, which can be more difficult for us to kind of get our head around, this death instinct, this destructive force. So, this accepting of, if you like, the inevitability of death, and actually kind of returning to the dust from which we were made, if you like. So the negation. So, and again, I think this is based on the principles of physical sciences, where everything is in balance and everything kind of returns. So Freud essentially started to develop this concept of thanatos upon recognizing that, as well as this life force, as well as this sexual drive, we have an aggressive drive. We have this death instinct. And although we might not like to think about it too much or spend too much time considering in what way it actually comes about, we do know that it does. We do know that actually we do have aggressive impulses within us, and that aggression can be external aggression, so aggressive towards other people or other things. It can be self-aggression as well, so we can turn our aggression inwards, self-harm, self-destruct, self-defeating behaviours. Okay, so we have this capacity to do that. Freud was also, born and lived within a time where there was a lot of unrest throughout the world. So 2 world wars, both within the century in which he lived, and trying to provide some kind of explanation as to how we as human beings actually kind of get to that stage of this, this mass destruction. So this libido, this energy, sits within our psyche. This is a model that you have seen before. So this is what we commonly call the iceberg model, and you just might like to just take a moment to just reflect on this model and remind yourself of the different aspects of this model here. And perhaps remind yourself as well that even though you've learnt this model previously, it's not necessarily that you found yourself using this model a lot in your practical therapy work. And you'll probably find that going forward that is also the case. So a kind of experiential understanding of this model takes a little bit of time, but eventually we can begin to really understand those unconscious dynamics that are happening within the client, that are happening within us as well, and that are happening in the relationship between therapist and client within the therapy sessions. Major assumptions of this model: the role of the unconscious is vital to psychodynamic theory. And as you can see from this iceberg model, the unconscious is a very large part of what Freud considers to be our total mind. Our emotions, beliefs and impulses are driven by unconscious processes, are driven by that energy within the system. Most of what drives us is buried in our unconscious but continues to influence. So, and what this theory proposes and believes is that a client's difficulties have their ultimate origins in childhood experiences, at least early life experiences. And a client may not be consciously aware of their true motives or impulses behind their actions. So, moving on to consider another aspect of Freudian theory, a part of his theory that we haven't really approached too much and has been sort of widely criticised by other theorists, is Freud's psychosexual theory. And this proposes that the energy of the libido moves around to concentrate on certain areas called erogenous zones of the infant as they are developing. And this process is happening very early on in somebody's life. So it's between the ages of 0 and 5 or 6. So one of the reasons why this part of Freud's theory has been criticised is that this was also a part of his theory that the general public, the populace kind of jumped on that, well, here is a very interesting development, this idea that children have erogenous zones and that children are sexually aware, and that's not what Freud meant at all. Okay, just meant that the energy of the id and the pleasure principle was moving around different parts of the infant. So the first stage, for example, where the energy is directed towards the mouth and feeding, okay, and feeling satisfied through feeding, that's the oral stage. And then when the child is thinking more and toilet training and so on is more important, then that's the anal stage, and there the energy is focused towards that area. And then we have the phallic stage, so where again the energy is focused on that area. And then Freud moved on to just consider, okay, after that comes a latency phase where not much is happening in terms of this particular model. So we don't tend to put a lot of emphasis on that psychosexual stage model today, but one development of it was from one of Freud's students, Erik Erikson, and he actually went on to develop this psychosexual theory, but to actually focus it more on a social aspect. So more about the importance of relationships and how we learn to socialise. So Erikson accepted most of Freud's work, including this stage theory, and his theory of stages of development goes way past those very early years throughout life and is based on what we call an epigenetic principle. So that means that each stage is a stage of development in Erikson's model, and we need to, as much as possible, successfully move through one stage in order to determine the success of the next stages. So each stage has an optimal time period that Erikson defines, and each stage requires, as much as possible, the successful completion of tasks. I think it will be a lot easier for you to perhaps understand what I mean here if I show you this graph here. So over here we have Erikson's stage theory, and you can see that on the left-hand column here we have stages in terms of age. So the first stage, infancy, 0 to 1 year, broadly corresponds with Freud's oral stage, as does early childhood and play age also correspond broadly to Freud's psychosexual stages. So, but actually, what Erikson is talking about here in this model is being able to develop core skills, core aspects of our personality that then help us throughout our life. And he says that these core aspects develop specifically at different stages of our actual development. So, and each of those stages has within it a conflict, a basic conflict that has to be negotiated by the person. And how successfully that is done will then either lead to this virtue or this resolution or this actual skill that we have or not. And as we move through our developmental stages, then we are developing these resources, so often called ego strengths, the development of our ego, of our sense of self, if you like, and and our ego strength comes alongside these virtues. So the first one here, and I'm not going to go through this all, and this is in your course notes as well. The first one here, the conflict is a basic sense of trust versus mistrust. So how does the infant, who is very young at this stage, develop this basic sense of trust or not? Well, that depends to a complete extent, really, on their caregivers, on the support that they have from their caregivers. Are their needs being met? So because the infant is helpless in themselves, the infant needs somebody to care for them and to do everything for them. So can the infant develop trust that actually they will be fed, they will be cuddled, they will be kept warm, they will have their needs met? And will they then realise that yes, that is happening, and therefore they are able to trust that that happens? If that's not happening, if care is erratic or neglectful, then the child may not be able to develop that basic feeling of trust in the world, trust that they are safe, trust that they are going to be kept well. So if they don't grow up with that feeling of trust, then there is already a kind of hopelessness that has developed there. Okay. And then, having an appreciation as an adult in older age of, an appreciation of the value of interdependence and relating with others just might be absent because all throughout life we have not been able to develop that particular virtue. So with that particular virtue in place, then we can move forward to perhaps deal with the next conflict which we need to develop, which is related to autonomy versus shame. So here again, this corresponds broadly with Freud's work, okay, and toilet training, so the anal stage, okay. So, is the child learning to feel control over his body, control over his muscles, control not just over toilet training, but also other aspects, able to, feel that his motor skills are increasing, are improving, he can do more things. And a sense of strength about that, okay. And again, if this stage is not fully successfully negotiated, then it's going to affect those future stages. So, an important aspect of Erikson's theory here is that it moves past Freud's initial stage theory, and as we can see, also talks about the importance of what we develop during school years and adolescence and early adulthood and older adulthood, and indeed right to old age. And this model hopes that by the time we reach old age, we have developed wisdom as well as all the other virtues, and that we feel a sense of integrity. We are integrated. We feel comfortable with who we are. So we feel strong enough. We feel strong enough to withstand what is perhaps for many an inevitable physical disintegration and towards our death. But we feel comfortable kind of looking back that actually we're satisfied with our life. We've had a good life, we've done things to the best of our ability, and we feel that we have these ego strengths. So it's an interesting model, and one of the ways that perhaps it's helpful for us is when we are taking a client's case history and and where they feel they are in their stages of development. And perhaps we can also, if we're talking about sort of key experiences, difficulties, traumas that have occurred in their life, then that may make a difference to how successfully they've been able to negotiate certain stages. So if trauma comes very early on, that's going to affect all future stages in this epigenetic principle, because epigenetic means an unfolding in a certain order. So it's a little bit like if somebody is building a building, then if the foundation isn't strong, it doesn't really matter perhaps how strong the next levels are if the foundation remains weak. It's still going to be a weak building. So we can kind of map this, and if we think in terms of our case conceptualization, and in particular if we wanted to actually draw this out as some kind of graph, okay, then we may be able to actually map the case conceptualization onto Erikson's stages that he talks about, and to consider whether conflict or trauma or difficulty that has occurred at different stages has had an impact on the type of ego strengths and resources that Erikson considers it's really important that we develop to have a full and integrated life. So the pluralistic approach places emphasis on structure of sessions, and here we can see how using a case conceptualization like this one shown here, and like we've previously discussed, can also acknowledge Erikson's stage theory, and indeed Erikson's stage theory can acknowledge this as well. So that might be something that you pick up in class and perhaps even have a chance to practice, don't forget to do your extra reading around this as well. So the next theory that we're going to take a very brief look at is Melanie Klein's object relations theory. So again, Melanie Klein, a disciple, a student of Freud's, went forward to develop her own theory based on Freud's original psychoanalytic work. And Klein's theory has been very important. So it's a popular theory with psychodynamic practitioners. And it takes, just like Erikson's does, it takes the emphasis away from psychosexual stages and talks more about psychosocial, talks more about the importance of relatedness, the importance of relationships for our successful development. So, other theorists who have also picked up on this particular type of theory, Fairbairn and Mahler. Now, the focus here in Klein's object relations theory is once again on early development. But in particular, Klein's theory is focused on very early relationships, primarily with the mother, because even looks at the relationship between the infant and the mother while the infant is still in the womb. So, and looks at issues relating to intimacy, dependency, and identity. And has this particular model which Klein proposes so to actually demonstrate object relations, which is where the model involves a subject and an object, and the subject is relating to the object. Now the object is, let's first of all say that the object is external, later on may become internal. The subject is going to be the infant. So the subject is the infant, and the object is then most likely to be a significant person in the infant's life. So their caregiver, and most often in Klein's theory, that's the mother. So the subject is the person, the infant, or in therapy work it would be the client, okay? And the object is the object to which the subject relates. And relations is how the subject interacts with the world, so their environment and with other people. So let's take a moment to try and imagine how it feels to be a really, really young infant. What would we be aware of? We don't yet have cognitive development. We don't yet have development of many of our functions at all. We're not thinking in language. We're not sure about emotions. What actually are we aware of? What's actually happening for us? So Klein thought about this carefully and says that actually the baby is in a constant dreamlike state. A constant dreamlike state with no concept of the world. So the world is just something that is misunderstood, can't understand. And therefore, says Klein, the infant experiences a great deal of anxiety and discomfort. The external world begins to be experienced as a series of objects, or what Klein calls part objects, because first of all, the young child cannot experience the mother, if the mother is the object, can't experience the mother as a whole person, doesn't recognise what another person is, and feels actually that they are creating their world. So the child feels perhaps a sensation of hunger, a sensation, an uncomfortable sensation that their stomach is empty, and they feel that discomfort as a hunger. So then, because they feel that sensation, they are then creating the food that comes to them. They are creating the object. They are not seeing the mother as somebody who is actually thinking, my child is crying and therefore they need food. It's like the child feels that they are creating the food for themselves. So they are creating the source of actually being able to reduce that hunger. So even if the child is recognizing the mother as an object, they're not recognizing the object as the mother. And this is where we have the concept of part objects. So it may be that the object is actually the breast, or the bottle, or the water, or the toy. An object can be a person, but a part person can also be an object. And indeed, an object can be an object. So the external object is the actual object that exists outside of the child, at least in our rational world. But then introjection is a process that occurs, according to Klein, for the child, where the child begins to internalise aspects of the object so that they feel that they are creating the object themselves. The internal object is then the subject's representation of the other. Now, objects can be represented as good or bad. So those that satisfy desires are good, and those that don't are not. So the child is hungry and the child cries for food, and food comes, and that breast, that bottle is a good object. The child is hungry and the child cries for food, and food does not come. So that breast or bottle or food is a bad object. So the child has to deal with this and is still in this kind of fusion, this dreamlike state, okay, where they are not being able to differentiate between an external object and what they've actually internalized for themselves. So, what starts to happen then is a splitting process starts to occur where the child wants to hold on to their representation of the good object and to be able to get rid of the bad object. Now, all of this, you might be surprised to hear, is happening, according to Klein, very early on in the infant's life. So, and the stages that Klein talks about within these very early experiences are related to the experience of anxiety and how to deal with anxiety and how to manage anxiety. So according to Klein, 0 to 4 months, the child, she calls this the paranoid schizoid position. Defense against anxiety is to split good and bad experiences into divisions. So just said, splitting those objects, keeping the idealized good objects and part of themselves separate from the feared or the hated or the bad objects. A total splitting into good and bad with no grey area in between. Food comes and satisfies hunger, good. Food doesn't come, so hunger is still there, bad. So the child then has to negotiate and repair from this position as they move through this stage. And the successful reparation of this position is the child taking in the goodness and enabling that to trust and love later on, forming a strong sense of self. The next stage from 4 months on to 2 years, the depressive position. And what's happening here is that the child is beginning to experience reality more clearly. They kind of already know now, just like Erikson talks about, that hopefully survival is a given, mum is coming back, so there is less need for splitting. Part objects are seen more whole, and there is more of a realisation that mum is actually a whole person. But there's also the realisation then that mum is a whole person who they have perceived as both good and bad, loved and hated. And this then leads to a grief and a sadness that they have hated the same object that they love. So the successful reparation of this position is realising that love can mend. And this is where a child's natural tantrums as they are developing is interspersed with an absolute need, says Klein, to show love and affection towards the object of their mum. In terms of anxiety, the older child and indeed the adult can regress to these positions. So for example, in grief or in extreme stress. And we do actually see often this splitting, this occurs for people in terms of stress. And we can perhaps think of our own examples here of when we have sort of, seen life very much in black and white, something is good or it's bad, whether this is related to a particular experience or a particular person or group of people, okay? So it's worth considering that this is, it feels quite primal. So Fairbairn, as I mentioned, is another object relations theorist. and developed his work to talk around the idea of projective identification. And here is where we start to find the value of working therapeutically in this way. So projective identification is a defense mechanism, and it's similar, but goes a step further than projection. And it's quite similar in some respects to transference and countertransference. So projection, if you remember from previous work on ego defense mechanisms, is where there is, part of our experience, part of our memories, that part object that we have repressed, suppressed, and actually instead of keeping it inside, instead of repressing completely, we project it outwards. So something that we dislike about ourselves, instead of holding it in, we decide that we see it in others. So we project it outwards. Then we see it in them. But the interesting thing about projective identification is that it goes a stage further, because we project it in such a way and with such a strength, if you like, that the other person introjects it. So they actually take on the characteristics of what we have projected outwards. And then, so this is an unconscious process. People don't realise that it's happening, and there is a subtle manipulation involved from the individual who's doing the projection. So then, if the individual is projecting out unacceptable qualities about themselves, so let's say, jealousy, okay, then they will see the other person as the jealous person that they can't accept about themselves. But then the other person starts finding themselves acting in that jealous way. So in therapy, what we can find occurring is that actually the therapist themselves starts to pick up and identify with the projections that the client is pushing towards us. We start to feel differently. We start to notice that our responses are not usual. We start to notice that there is something in the dynamics of the relationship that feels complex, that feels kind of unconsciously discomfort. It's something that is quite difficult to actually really establish when it happens, and it takes good supervision and a lot of self-reflection as well. Why is it that I always feel this way when I work with this particular client? Why is it that I always find myself thinking in this way, behaving in this way? What is it that I am aware of within myself working with this particular client that I'm not aware of when I work with other clients? And of course, our self-reflective and our self-development work, very important here to be able to separate out that which actually does belong to us and that which doesn't belong to us. So our real, actual responses and the responses that are actually being projected onto us and that we are introjecting. So projective identification, a process where aspects of the inner self that don't want to be acknowledged are induced in the other person. And the other person, e.g. the therapist, is pulled into responding a certain way by the client, a step further than the ego defense mechanism of projection. So Fairbairn, looking at this model, sees the purpose of therapy then to be able to note and recognise, first of all, those projections that are happening for the client, and then to actually identify the projective identification. Now, if that can happen, if the therapist can become aware of the projective identification, then in this model they are becoming aware of that about the client which the client can't accept within themselves. Now what's happened is there has been, there's been a breach of the closed system of the client. Something has been exposed. Something has been exposed from the client that the client doesn't know about because this process happens unconsciously. But we know that these ego defense mechanisms, they're as some kind of unconscious coping strategy, but also cause a lot of problems in themselves because they are diverting, distorting the opportunity to bring unconscious processes into conscious awareness so that we can then work through them. So this is this process happening. Okay, we're bringing something into, first of all, probably conscious awareness of the therapist, and then working with the client, helping the client to recognise that this is a projection from them that the therapist is identifying with. Now there is some genuine contact happening, because with the projection identified and with the projective identification identified as well, so that we can begin to see and relate beyond that, so that there can begin to be genuine contact. So then transference begins to diminish, so that instead of the client seeing the therapist the way that they have decided they need to see the therapist, they can begin to make contact with the therapist as the person that they actually are. And now there is the opportunity to actually treat each other as a unique individual. Complicated, yes, and takes a great deal of self-awareness and really, a great deal more training. And if this is an approach that you are particularly endeared towards, then it's something that does take further training, but very rewarding that training could be. But what we can learn to do is we can certainly learn to pick up these interesting transferences and counter-transferences that are happening for individuals within the therapy room, these dynamics, these psychodynamics that are occurring between client and therapist. So we're going to conclude our lecture today by just a revisit of contracting. So this is part of ethics, the law and good practice. And you've already had opportunity to understand the importance of good contracting. But at this point, especially when you are about to move on to placement work, or indeed perhaps have already started your placement work, then it's good to recap this. So remember that in a pluralistic approach, there is assessment, there's case conceptualization, and there's a collaborative agreement to work together. Today we have looked at a way where we can add another layer of case conceptualization, perhaps using Erikson's stage model. Contracting can be verbal or written and should cover all of the basic points. Now on placement, it can be usual that the contract is between the agency and the client. It may be that as a therapist working within the agency, you don't actually form the contract, and neither do you actually see or view the contract. So it's also unlikely that you would be keeping hold of the contract. But even so, it's still important that you are contracting at least verbally on the basic points with the client, so that you both understand the relationship that you are working with together. So basic things like when sessions are held and the length of sessions, how many sessions can be offered. That might be particularly important on placement, because very often there is a limitation due to finances to how many sessions a client can be offered. Limits of confidentiality, GDPR privacy statement, details of any fees if there are any. Okay, and these are the types of things that will be part of organisational policy, and you should make sure that you're very clearly aware of what organisational policy is. Okay, so your approach, your qualification, it might be important, for example, for the client to know that you're being transparent and letting them know that you are actually well supervised and working within the agency and in the final year of your studies, but you are still a student in training and not yet fully qualified. So you can talk about your code of ethics, your professional membership, and then again, within organisational policy, if it is appropriate or not. Very often it's not to have contact outside of therapy. Health and safety matters within the environment where you're working. What happens for missed or cancelled sessions? Very often agencies have quite clear policies on this because they have funding and they are charities, okay? And the expected length of therapy. So all of these are important for you and the client to be able to form that good therapeutic relationship. Okay, so that is us for today. Thank you for listening. So I just say once again that these theories, they're complex. Psychodynamic theory is complex. It takes a while, but if you agree, as I hope you do, that these are fascinating and really interesting theories and approaches, then do ensure that you follow these up. Follow these up with your reading, follow these up with questions to your tutor, and follow these up with discussions in class. Thank you. Thank you for listening.